Now let's have a look at Chapter 2, Moral Disagreement Today and the Claims of Emotivism. This term emotivism, it signifies a certain theory of ethics that MacIntyre thinks is deeply flawed, but incredibly popular. Popular not just simply amongst philosophers and people who talk about ethics for a living or in a variety of ways, but deeply popular in the sense that it's kind of like the software running in the background of our society. That this theory is really something that many people of society think ethics works along its lines. So part of the story that MacIntyre wants to tell about the explosion and the decontextualization of ethical terms will relate to the claims of emotivism. All right, but that's for a little bit later in this video and for ensuing videos, because this is a big thing that MacIntyre is grappling with. For now, he starts the chapter by looking at moral disagreement. And he's looking at it today, and he says, moral discourse today, what do you really notice about it? It's disagreement. People disagree all the time. And these discussions, well, they just seem to go on and on. So not only are the discussions everywhere, they just seem to never end. And they don't seem to be going anywhere. It's not like you can say, well, we've been talking about this in a variety of places for quite a while and we're closing in. No, that's not even the case. So their arguments are all over the place. That is disagreements. Disagreements are everywhere. They've been going on for seemingly forever, not literally, but as a figure of speech, they've just been going on all the time and they don't seem to be going anywhere. So it's just endless disagreement and pervasive disagreement. And then he looks at a couple examples of this, topics of war, abortion, and the topic of justice. And he, offers differing and opposing views on each of these topics to give you a flavor of how people are disagreeing. And then what he does is he says, okay, well, if we look at three areas of disagreement, namely a war, abortion, and the concept of justice, like what is justice, we can pick out some properties of these disagreements. And we can start to get a handle on what moral disagreement, what's really going on, what's the nature of disagreement that we're experiencing, and we can start trying to figure out if we can ascertain some salient properties of it, maybe we can figure out what led to it, and then maybe we can dig ourselves out of this mess of disagreements. Once again, MacIntyre is trying to problematize or pose a kind of problem of this contemporary moral confusion, or as remember the earlier video about this cognitive problem and this the moral problem of this decontextualization. And he says, if you look at these, I invite you to go and have a look at them in the chapter. But he pulls out three salient characteristics. And very interesting. There's one way in which they differ and two ways in which these disagreements are similar. So let's look first at at these three characteristics. And the first one is a conceptual incommensurability. Right? Not surprising that the notion of incommensurability and commensurability turns up at this time in MacIntyre's writing, because Kuhn is writing at this time, so it's not surprising that emotivism is going to be the object or the target of MacIntyre's attack, because in the philosophy of science, emotivism is closely connected to logical positivism, and logical positivism was being overturned well, due to its own internal problems and the external one of a competing way of understanding science, namely the way that Kuhn offered. And Kuhn talked about paradigms and different ways of understanding them, and he thought that they were incommensurable. So this term incommensurable, shall we say, was in the philosophical drinking water of the time. So let's see how MacIntyre presses the notion of incommensurability into use. Well, he finds it amongst all these disagreements. He says, if you notice, these disagreements, that is over war or abortion or the concept of justice, they're conceptually incommensurable. That is, the debates, he thinks, are between valid arguments, right? So that the arguments are fine. It's not that they're irrational or anything like that. The various arguments, let's say, for a certain position on abortion versus the arguments on a different position on abortion, he says they're all valid arguments. but the premises, though, really don't connect. Like, I may be able to understand your premises, but they're so different than mine, right? They just don't overlap at all. It's like we're arguing, as the old metaphor goes, in silos. You have your argument that's way over there, and okay, like, yeah, but my argument's over, and we start from such different premises that we don't even really have a common ground. Like we may have a common ground that we agree to talk about abortion, but we're talking about it from such different angles. Now, if I may, just to clarify a little bit, let's say with the abortion issue, we might say, yeah, we're going to talk about abortion, but we don't even, we come at it from such a different angle that we don't even agree what life is, right? Like you might have a certain understanding of what life is, and I may have a different one. So one person may talk about life in terms of just getting the right DNA, and the next person might talk about life in terms of communal existence with others, and et cetera, et cetera. So even your premises that lead up to your conclusions are so different, they're conceptually incommensurable, right? Even though your premises, the conclusion may follow from them very logically. So yeah, you got your valid argument, I got mine, but we can't even agree on what the basic premises are, and we might not even agree on basic terms like what life even means. So we're just way apart from each other, even though nobody's being irrational. We're being conceptual. We are engaged in conceptually incommensurable disagreements. Pretty bad stuff. Pretty hard to resolve those when you're not really even speaking the same conceptual language. So the concepts embedded in the opposing premises are radically different. They lack a common ground, hence incommensurable. Okay, so the second one is a commensurability. Notice how I'm sure when you argue, and I do it too, and I haven't met anyone who really, well, today it's becoming a little bit more of a challenge, but very few people claim to be offering anything but rational arguments. Everyone thinks, that he or she has rationality on their side, and that these are rational arguments. They're not just simply, well, abortion is wrong or right because I say so. No, it's a rational position. If you really think it through and you're rational about it, you'll see that my argument really isn't my argument. It's the rational argument. And then the next person comes along and goes, no. If you really think it through, you'll see that my argument, which is not really my argument, but what I'm propounding is the rational argument. So everyone has an aspirational commensurability. We're all aspiring to be the voice of reason, right? So in that sense, we're incommensurate, shall we say, conceptually, but at least we agree that, we all want to be the rational person, although some people are starting to challenge that. That's a different game. But pretty well, whenever I've argued with people that supposedly are challenging norms of rationality, no one claims that they're arguing just randomly and irrationally. That's usually when people claim that they're against rationality, they're really talking about something more in terms of a kind of hidden hegemony, rather than just being rational. Anyways, people may disagree with that, but certainly no one claims that they're just arguing randomly and irrational. Everyone has, I think MacIntyre is right, this aspiration to being, I'm being reasonable and rational. And even if, all the claims let's say all the claims of amongst the combatants are false. That is, that everyone who claims to be the voice of reason is making a false claim. They're still aspiring to it. That's MacIntyre's point. He's not saying anything more than that. He's just recognizing that everyone aspires to be this reason, this voice of reason. And he asks, why does everyone have this aspiration? And why this particular one? Why does everybody aspire to be reasonable? What is it about rational argument or reasonable argument that makes everyone claim that that's what they're pushing? Again, very few people ever flat-footedly assert that they're just arguing irrationally. That's very rare. I don't really come across that, even, as I said, when I've spoken to people who claim to be questioning objectivity and these things. It's very rare that there's just randomness and subjectivity. Very rarely that people say that. But again, we can debate that. But I think MacIntyre is pushing this kind of line that all the antagonists claim rationality he thinks that's a good thing, because at least that shows that we all agree we ought to be rational in our moral thinking. We may disagree on who gets to be that rational person, but we all basically agree that we should be rational about ethics. It's not just random and everything goes. So you've got, again, you've got a conceptual incommensurability. Don't forget incommensurability, that there's no common measure. But aspirational commensurability, there's a common measure. There's the aspiring to be rational. That's basically commensurate, just means having a common, some common measure. The last one is a methodological commensurability. And what does that mean? Well, he says if you look at all the arguments over things like, war and violence and abortion and the concept of justice, if you look at that, these arguments all draw on a wide variety of historical origins. Catalogs of great names. Well, I hold this view and I'm in the camp with John Locke, or well, I hold this view and I'm following in the footsteps of Immanuel Kant, and so on. So there is a kind of a catalog of great names. And in that sense, MacIntyre says there is a sort of a methodological commensurability. People try to slot themselves in traditions. And he says that, but this sort of name catalog could lead us into an overly simple view of the history of concepts. And he makes an important point here, which is quite interesting, which is not often made by philosophers. Although it's increasingly made by some philosophers that look more towards a broader understanding of the history of philosophy as embedded in society. And it goes something like this. If we just look at the catalog of great names, we end up, not surprisingly, having the great names in the history of philosophy. And as we know, there's been lots of good criticisms about this, but especially in the feminist camp about, well, this catalog of names, big surprise, it fits there's a certain profile of this, right? These tend to be well-educated men. They tend to be of, a certain kind of social background, et cetera, privilege, blah, blah, blah. So that gives you a very skewed version of the history of moral thinking. It's broader than just what went on in this quote-unquote history of the catalog of great names. That gives you an overly narrow and simplistic understanding of the history of moral thinking. So, by calling it moral philosophy and then limiting it, maybe academic moral philosophy, well, sure, if that's the story you want to tell, then you are admittedly saying, I'm not telling the story of moral thinking in general. I'm telling the story of, particular like academic philosophy in these 3 universities from this year to that year. Well, fine, but that's not the history of moral thinking. That's a subset of it, and it could be a very detached and very different view, right? So that's why we should be careful when we say, oh, Aristotle, if you want to know how the ancient Greeks thought about morality, you just read Aristotle. Well, no, not necessarily, because again, that would be looking at Aristotle and Plato. They were part of that society, but they articulated the values and ideas of that society with their own. They changed things, so you just can't say they perfectly, without any filtering, are a perfect representation of the society they lived in. So philosophers articulate society's views. Yes, MacIntyre admits that. They're not practicing in a background. In a vacuum, we have a background, right? I live in the world just like anybody else. As a professional philosopher, but then I'll have my spin on things, and it wouldn't be the case that if you just that I represent society. No, that's again, that is ignoring the fact that people like myself, we have partial and selective manners in the way we look at society and when we write about it. These moral concepts, MacIntyre is saying, are already detached when they're taken up into philosophy from their larger embedding sociological contexts, right? So you can see his thesis about this sort of detachment and decontextualization of moral concepts. It's already emerging in the disagreements, right? Because of notions of schools and things like that in philosophy. And we often use terms in a variety of ways, like moral pluralism, to describe various discussions and disagreements, but it's not a very terribly precise term, MacIntyre says. It could apply to like what he calls an unharmonious mélange of ill-assorted fragments. And it could be just, a dialogue dealing with various views. So it's not, it could be various clear views, different choices, or this unharmonious melange of different views. MacIntyre thinks that really moral pluralism is this kind of big mess. It's not just clear, clear views, that it's really kind of a mess that we're in. And so reality is the latter. So by stripping these moral concepts of their original contexts, these have changed their meaning in various ways, and MacIntyre thinks various deep ways over the years. So I think there's a little bit of tension in these assessments of MacIntyre's, but in any case, he's asking, okay, now how are we going to write the history of these kinds of meaning changes undergone by important moral concepts like duty, ought, virtue, piety, and justice? Well, he's going to look into that in a little more detail, and we're going to follow up on this in the next video.